Good afternoon, live from Middletown, Connecticut. This is WESU 81 FM, and you're tuning into The Roar in Politics with DJ Politico. Today is November 3rd, 2018, and it's about 4:33 p.m. I want to thank Jim for helping me with the transition. We are 3 days from the elections, folks, if you haven't heard yet. 151 days, 151 state representative seats, 36 state Senate seats, 4 statewide seats, congressional seats, and of course the governor's mansion will all be up for grabs this Tuesday. Currently, the state Senate is divided evenly among party lines, 18 Democrats and 18 Republicans. If either party seeks to control the Senate chamber next year, every race counts this election, especially the District 9 state Senate seat, which includes the cities of Middletown, Cromwell, Wethersfield, Newington, and Rockyville. In fact, we have State Representative Matt Lesser, who's running to occupy the 9th Senate seat after Paul Doyle, on the program to talk about his candidacy for the state Senate. Also, we'll be taking calls today. If you have questions for Representative Matt Lesser about his candidacy, his policy priorities, anything, and you can call at 860-685-7700. I'll try my best to monitor your calls and at the same time get through the interview. But the next 25 minutes, if you have any questions for Representative Lester, that would be great, and I'd be happy to have you on the show. Representative Lester, thank you for being on the program.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you. Representative Lester, tell us a little bit about you. What was childhood like? Your community involvement in Middletown, what inspired you to get in politics, and why you ultimately decided to run for the state Senate.
Well, that's a lot there. I'm not sure I could give you my full life story, but I've been, I live in Middletown in the North End with my wife Sarah. She's an attorney, and I've been fortunate enough to represent the city of Middletown now for 10 years. And over the last 10 years, we've come a long way as a state, but. I think Middletown is doing a lot better. Been able to do a whole lot to bring back additional funding for the community, to support people across the town. And my hope is, as we look to the future, that I will be able to work just as hard for the people across the 9th Senate District and the other towns that you mentioned.
Okay. Well, thank you, Representative Lester. If you're elected to the state Senate, what would be your main legislative priorities, and why would you choose these priorities in particular?
Well, I want to be an independent voice for working families, and what that entails, go down a long list of things that I think we need to do to strengthen and grow the middle class in this state. I think on Tuesday, people are going to have a choice between two different ideas about how we create prosperity in the state. One is by enriching a few super wealthy people at the top and hope that the rest of that money comes and trickles down to us. The other is to create prosperity by raising people up, by raising wages. I think we can raise the minimum wage, expanding, making sure that we're protecting access to health care. I think everyone in this state should have access to earned family medical leave. I think we've got to deal with the issue of college affordability. We've got to keep young people in this state. And that's why I've been really a leader on the issue of student loans and student debt to try to ease the burden on young people. And we've got to protect our quality of life too, which is why it's so important that we protect our environment.
So just can you elaborate a little bit more when so on your campaign website you said Matt has always been an independent voice who fights for working families. Can you just elaborate a little bit more when you mean being an independent voice in the state Senate?
So I'm a proud Democrat, and I am a Democrat's Democrat. But sometimes I disagree with my party, and what I've always done as a legislator is to put my district first. That's why last year, when I felt that the state budget did not serve the interests of people in my community, I voted against it, and that took some guts, but it was the right thing to do. And this year, when we were able to increase funding for Middletown by $5.8 million and secure funding for a new middle school and do that without raising taxes, I was proud to support the budget. I think that the thing that I've always shown is really a commitment to do what I think is right based on what I'm hearing from my constituents and really looking to my own values and really governing on the basis of what I think my values are consistent with.
And so going back, talking about the budget, the General Assembly's Office of Fiscal Analysis a nonpartisan office in the legislature said that the state is projected to have a $2.1 billion budget deficit for fiscal year 2020. Representative Lester, how do you plan to work with your colleagues if you're elected to the state senate to address this budget deficit? Do you have any concrete or specific solutions to get Connecticut out of its fiscal problems?
Yes. Well, if I had all the answers, I'd probably be running for governor, none for the state senate. It's going to be tough. I think what we have to do is two or three different things that I would sort of emphasize as priorities. One is we have to maintain budget discipline and making sure that we're maintaining progress towards paying off our unfunded liabilities. For too long, the legislature and past governors kicked the can down the road. I didn't address our liabilities. That's painful, but we have to make sure that we're meeting our funding commitments to retirees in our state workforce and to bondholders on Wall Street. But we also have to do more to grow the economy. I mean, one of the reasons why it's so tough for us to make these payments is because we haven't been growing our population. Our economy hasn't grown over the last 2 decades. That's why I'm so interested in issues like student debt that could really, I think right now, hobbling the economy because you graduate from college, you graduate from UConn or Wesleyan deeply in debt, you can't take the risk of starting a new business, right? You are going to get the first job you can get, right? Because you can't, you have to make the payment every single month. And so what I think is really critical is as we look to make college more affordable, as we look to deal with issues like that, we're giving breathing room for young people to take risks, to buy houses, to stay in the community, and to maybe even start up a business.
So what exactly do you want to do about the student loan crisis, particularly in Connecticut?
Well, one thing I think we absolutely have to do, I wrote something called the Student Loan Bill of Rights. It's the first law of its kind anywhere in the country, and it's now been copied by a whole bunch of other states. And what it does is it regulates the student loan companies. It says they have to meet the same standards that every other lender out there has to meet. And that means they can't be ripping people off, overcharging them, steering them into paying more than they absolutely have to. Everybody who's taken out loans has a responsibility, but nobody should be forced to pay one penny more than they absolutely have to. Unfortunately, the United States Secretary of Education under Mr. Trump, a woman named Betsy DeVos, does not want any regulations whatsoever over the student loan industry. So she is fighting against us. She's supporting litigation in federal court to strike down these protections. I think we got to fight her on it. I think we've got to protect people paying off their student loans. I also think we got to deal with the cost of college on the front end. It's one thing to deal with the loan industry. It's another thing to make sure that people aren't going so deeply into debt in the first place. And that's why I think if you actually crunch the numbers, we could make a real big difference by making community college free. We could do that for a drop in the bucket. And if people get college degrees, they're going to make a lot more money. They're going to be able to get jobs. Pratt & Whitney here in Middletown is desperate to hire people, but they don't have people who meet the skill set of the jobs that are out there. And we've got to make sure that we're upskilling the population in Connecticut to meet our workforce needs. So
going back, going to community college, like how will you balance your campaign priorities while tackling the state's economic malaise or fiscal problems? For example, you say on your campaign website that, as you alluded to right now, you want to make community college free, but how do you plan to fund this when the state is facing deep budget problems? Well,
I think we can actually, I think it'll pay for itself. I think it'll pay for itself very quickly. But we have a $20 billion state budget. That's how much we pay for state government every year. That's pretty big. The cost of making community college free is somewhere between $5 and $30 million. So it's not nothing. It's going to take a lot of work to find that money, but it is a relatively small part of our state budget. I think we can find savings to do that. I could give you some of the places where I think we could look between the couch cushions. I think one place that we desperately need to reform is our state's Department of Economic Community Development. We've been throwing out a lot of money to CEOs to try to entice them to move here. I think it doesn't work super well. I think we could take some of that money, be much better spent supporting our community colleges and helping students afford their education.
So do you think the state should explore whether it should use the rainy day fund, which is currently now set at $1.2 billion and potentially $2 billion next summer, according to the Connecticut Mirror, to pay down deficit? Would you be in favor of using some of the rainy day reserve funds? It has been done before but would you favor that?
That's a great question, and no, I think I would be very concerned about doing that. I am right now. The economy is actually doing okay. I think we should keep the rainy day fund for when the economy is really hurting, and I'm worried that we may be around the corner from another recession nationally, and I think it would be a bad move to dip into the rainy day fund too early.
Okay. So you talk about you want to, for example, in your campaign website again, saying that you want to help the middle class. So what ideas do you have to reinvigorate growth in the middle class, especially to wage growth and keeping young people in the state of Connecticut?
Well, we got to raise wages for one thing. I mean, I think even though the economy is growing, a lot of that isn't being felt by ordinary people. And it's not just the middle. When I say growing the middle class, I know that there are a lot of people who aren't in the middle class right now. There are a lot of working people out there who want to be in the middle class but aren't right now. And I think we've got to raise the minimum wage. I think we've got to find ways to support our skilled trades to make sure that we're paying construction workers out there a fair, prevailing wage, that we're doing more to lift people up and make sure that people who are working full-time in the state can support a family. That means we need predictive scheduling for people who are out on the job. That means we need to make sure that people out there we're pursuing policies in our economic development incentives that we're really making sure that we're encouraging companies to pay their workers more. I also can tell you that there was an entire day out last week where I was knocking doors, probably 5 hours. I was out knocking doors in Newington and listening to people. Just what do you care about? And one door after another, every single person I talked to that day said their number one issue was healthcare. And if we don't do something about the cost of healthcare in this state, we're going to lose the rest of our middle class. We've got to address that. And I think there's a lot we could do on that front to make healthcare more affordable.
So going on healthcare, you wrote last year in the Hartford Courant that, quote unquote, we should follow the suggestion of Lieutenant Governor Nancy Wyman and create our own individual mandate, something Massachusetts did with bipartisan support. We could then use the revenue generated to make healthcare more affordable, end quote. How feasible do you think this is if you seek to introduce it in the next legislative session in 2019, or are you still committed to this idea of the individual mandate in Connecticut? Yeah,
I am. Well, I think that's a short-term solution. I don't think that's a long-term solution. But so Massachusetts has done a whole bunch of things to reduce the cost of healthcare and stabilize the Affordable Care Act, and as a result, the average premium increase in Massachusetts was $3,000 less than in Connecticut. I mean, that's a lot of money for families out there. Massachusetts has more people with insurance, and they cost less than in Connecticut. So if they're doing it, we should as well. The only reason I wasn't able to pass that bill this year was because we didn't have the votes in the state Senate. That's a big part of why I'm running right now for the state Senate, was to make sure that we can do more to address the cost of health insurance coverage. We can expand subsidies for families that are having trouble affording it. We can make it more affordable. And Massachusetts shows that it's doable. Now, I think there is something else that we could do as well. I think we need a public option. We need to be able to to increase competition in the health insurance marketplace. And I think one way to do that is to look at opening up our state's Medicaid plan, our Husky plan, to people if they want to purchase coverage that way too.
I see. Oh, well, thank you, Representative Lester. So, also going back on the minimum wage, so do you find many receptive in the state to increase the minimum wage? For example, I know that you were a co-sponsor of House bill in this previous legislative session to increase minimum wage over time gradually, and then fixed it, to CPI and inflation. Mm-hmm. Do you find many receptive to that, and how come that bill didn't come to fruition at the end?
Well, we have very close margins right now in the legislature, right? It's a very closely divided legislature, and the Senate is evenly divided between 18 Democrats and 18 Republicans, as you pointed out. And unfortunately, the Republican Party today does not seem to believe in the minimum wage. Bob Stefanowski, who's running for governor, has said he doesn't believe in the minimum wage at all. And frankly, people out there who are working really hard, who are working 2-3 jobs, are having trouble making ends meet. I think that's a problem, and I think the way to do that is to raise wages. You shouldn't. Nobody who's working to support a family in Connecticut should be living in poverty. even while working full time. And I think we can raise the minimum wage. The cost of an apartment in Middletown, I think you need to make over $20 an hour to afford an apartment in Middletown. Now, I'm not proposing that we go to raise the minimum wage that high, but it just shows you just how out of whack we are with the cost of living versus how much people are earning.
So let's talk about transportation. You and many others have talked about transportation and have recognized that to be a big problem. But it seems a little bit unclear how people will improve transportation roads in Connecticut. For example, you said in the political forum during the Rocky Hill Chamber of Commerce that
you've done your homework.
Oh, thank you. That you said that you're open to tolls, but you said that any politician that lies to you about having transportation is clearly lying to you. But so what are you supportive of tolls? If not, or also are you in support of the lockbox measure that's on before the ballot for the voters on Tuesday?
Well, thank you for the question, and let me be just absolutely crystal clear with you. I think we are in a transportation funding crisis. We have to figure out a way forward if we're going to keep the bridges from collapsing and make sure that we're paving roads and providing funding for mass transit. We need to have a new source of revenue, or else we're not going to be able to keep people safe in the state. I mean, it is a real problem right now, and the reason we're in that crisis is just simply that cars are getting more fuel efficient, so we're getting less revenue year in, year out, and every year the cost of projects gets a little bit more expensive with inflation. What I have said with regard to tolls, I want to see what the plan is right up off the front. And the problem I had with the legislation that DOT put forward this year was they couldn't give me a straight answer as to how much they were looking to raise, where the tolls were going to go, what the plan was. And I don't believe in delegating that authority to the Department of Transportation. I think the state legislature should vote yes or no on a specific plan. And I am open to tolls. I think that is absolutely a conversation that we should be having. But I don't believe in delegating the legislature's authority to the executive branch. I think they should come to us with a plan, and I can vet it at that point and see, all right, does this make sense or not? And I think that my answer will depend on what that plan actually looks like.
And then the second part of my question was, are you in support of the lockbox amendment?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I am. And that's going to be on the ballot on Tuesday. That's question 1. And what it does is it says that funding can't be, there's a lot of people concerned that funding could be diverted out of the transportation fund, the special transportation fund, and this would prevent that from happening. And that would be put in the state constitution. So, yes, I support it, and voters can vote on that on Tuesday.
And so, recently the Commission on Fiscal Stability and Economic Growth released a report, this past spring, and they suggested, a hike in sales taxes, highway tolls, and reducing the income tax. You already addressed the highway tolls, but are you in favor of hikes in sales taxes or
No.
property tax reform or reducing the income tax?
Well, I'm in favor of property tax reform. I think a lot of the Fiscal Stability Commission recommendations, while they were, certainly well-intentioned, had the effect of raising taxes on poor people and middle-class people in the state while cutting them for the super wealthy. And to be honest, I think that's the opposite of what we should be doing. I think, I don't want to raise taxes on anybody, but the last thing we should be doing is shifting the cost burden, the burden of taxing away from billionaires and onto working people. I think that is nuts. And so there's specific parts of the recommendations that I don't have a problem with, but the overall pitch I think was dead wrong. And both parties looked at that and they shook their heads and said, no, we're not going to do this.
So going back to property tax reform, so Ned Lamont suggested the idea or floating the idea of property tax credit. Would you be in favor of that credit? Oh,
yeah. So Ned Lamont wants to restore the property tax credit. That's a few $100 that you get every year. I think that makes sense. I think that would be great. We have to figure out whether we can afford that or not. But yeah, sure, that helps reduce the burden. I think there's more that we can do to address it. The fact is that the wealthier you are in Connecticut, the lower the effective tax rate, and the poorer you are, the higher. You look at the towns that have the highest property taxes in Connecticut; they are some of the poorest towns in the country. It's places like Hartford and New Haven, and yet the lowest tax rate is in the wealthiest communities. And to me, that's absolutely backwards.
And so would you be in favor of reducing the income tax, or you would not be? Or you had to explore a plan, or
reducing the income tax. The income tax. Nobody likes paying the income tax. I think Bob Stefanowski's plan to reduce or eliminate the income tax is nuts. What that would do is give a massive tax break to about 400 families in Greenwich and Lower Fairfield County, these super wealthy billionaires, and I don't want them to pay a penny more than they have to. But that would shift the cost of the tax burden onto us, onto the rest of the state, the people in our area, and would lead almost inevitably to a massive shift in taxes onto middle class and working people. And I think that's a terrible idea. So no, I think that if you cut the income tax, it's going to result in a property tax increase, and that's a terrible idea. I also don't think a sales tax increase would be a good idea for the same reason.
So are you suggesting the idea of having a more progressive tax structure?
I think we do need a more progressive tax structure, absolutely.
Okay. And then lastly, well, no, actually not. We'll see how it goes. What do you make of the Harvard Courant's endorsement of Oz Gabriel? They wrote the state of Connecticut is underwater, years of complacement. Again, this is editorial endorsing Oz. Mm-hmm. And Republican leadership have done little to right the ship. In that same article, they said, quote unquote, neither the Republicans nor the Democrats came up with candidates with the tools necessary to lead the legislature out of its paralysis, bring its state employee unions to the table, responsibly foster the business climate, or chart a clear path for long-term growth, end quote. What do you think about what they said? Is there complacent Democratic leadership? You've been in the legislature for 10 years. What's your take on this?
Well, I know Oz, and I love the guy, but he's not going to win on Tuesday. He's at 9% in the polls, and so I think that means you just really have a choice between Ned Lamont and Bob Stefanowski, and Bob Stefanowski has, I think, come up with this ridiculous plan to cut taxes for really rich guys like Bob Stefanowski, but has no plan to pay for it. And the only way I can imagine he'd do it is to shift the burden of schools and other local services onto middle-class families at places like Middletown. And I don't want to pay for Bob Stefanowski's tax cut, and you shouldn't either. So my hope is that people out there on Tuesday, there's a whole bunch of candidates. There's a lot of nasty TV and whatnot. But my hope is that the overwhelming majority of people in this area are going to be out there voting for Ned Lamont, because he's the only guy out there who's actually talking about the issues that really matter to people, as opposed to a tax cut for rich guys in Fairfield County.
But do you agree with Courant that there's been complacent Democratic leadership?
I think there's a lot more that we could do as a state. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited of the work we have to do ahead. I think that I've been certainly frustrated at times with the direction of things in Hartford, and that's why I've opposed my own party on stuff, and that's why I'm running for the Senate. I think I can do a lot more in the Senate and be. I've been a real agent of change in the House. But there are 151 House members, and in the Senate, I'll have more of a platform to really be a leader on issues important to families in this part of the state.
But do you find that 9% in the recent poll supporting Oz significant? Because you take anything away from it? For example, people being frustrated of both parties' performance at the state level. For example, recent polls also show that people are equally disapproving of both the Democratic and Republican Party in the state of Connecticut. Should we take anything from that 9% supporting Oz?
Yeah, people are frustrated in Connecticut, and I get that. But they're looking forward right now, and they're looking at the policies that Donald Trump and the Republicans are pushing in Washington, policies that have often deliberately targeted Connecticut. The tax bill they rammed through this year raised taxes on people across Connecticut. And Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and the head of the Office of Management and Budget, they basically mocked the impact that was going to have on Connecticut. These guys are out for us. And so we're going to have a choice on Tuesday whether or not we want to be enablers of Trump, or we're going to stand up for Connecticut and Connecticut values. And I think they're going to recognize that, all frustrations aside, the Democratic Party is really the only party that's really out there standing up for our values. It's not just issues right now. It's about values. And I think they'll see that in my race too.
So just quickly, are you going to do anything about the SALT taxes that were removed, the SALT deductions, for example, the state and local tax deductions that Donald Trump removed in his tax plan? Do you plan to do anything about it?
Yeah. Well, we passed something this year, a pass-through entity tax, a change the structure to try to get some people access to the SALT deduction. This is the tax increase that Donald Trump and the Republicans passed on a lot of middle-class families in Connecticut. And we're trying to find workarounds. It's tough because the IRS is fighting us on this. Trump has instructed his agencies to really fight to raise taxes on people in Connecticut. And, for a guy who's saying that he's offering tax relief, I think that is bizarre that he's out there raising taxes on Connecticut families. But you look at it, that's what he's doing. So I don't know how we're going to be able to do it, but we have some ideas that are out there. They're being challenged in court. But my hope is that we'll find workarounds to help people get keep their tax liabilities under control.
And then 30 seconds, do you have any last words to say to to residents of Middletown?
Sure. So, over the last week, if you live in the district, you've gotten a bombardment of the most vile, horrific stuff about me. My opponent has thrown the kitchen sink at me, and there's been a lot of coverage about it. And what I can just tell you is this isn't just a question of issues, although I hope when people look at the issues, they'll see I've really worked for the city. It's a question of values. And I hope they'll vote for me on Tuesday.
Okay, thank you, Representative Lester. The election's next Tuesday, and you can make your vote then, make your voice heard. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a happy Thanksgiving. See you all later. Thank you.